walk around and do something to you.
And there's, listen. As the dark turned light, my day started like a margin. Jumping straight out of bed, cause I heard a gun sparking. Started alarming my peoples, waking them up. When I heard 2 shots from a window, I'm bugging matters. To make it simple, go by my window with shots. I bust 3 times, somebody said, "You want your back, cops?" I couldn't focus, eyes loaded with cold. A car pulled off real slow, doing about 5 or more. I started flipping, disrespecting my house. Snatch about to start bugging, started hugging my spouse. I had to be out, no doubt. Investigator who was watching me, see who was flying on me and why they was busting shots at me. Get my crib had a balcony, I would've hit one. And
Good morning. Welcome to Criminal Justice Insider with BABZ, RAWLS-IVY, and Jeff Grant. I'm BABZ, RAWLS-IVY.
And I'm Jeff Grant.
Good morning. And this show is made possible by sponsorship from the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven, now more than ever.
Now more than ever, Bab.
So we are excited because we have Glenn Martin today as our guest.
We do.
We've been excited to have Glenn E. Martin, founder and senior consultant of GEM Trainers, or GEM Trainers, and founder and past president of Just Leadership USA. So y'all know Glenn E. Martin. He's the founder and senior consultant at GEM Trainers, but we know him as the founder of Just Leadership USA, an organization dedicated to cutting the U.S. correctional population in half by 2030. For almost 20 years, he has been part of the vanguard of successful advocates and nonprofit leaders in America. So that's about all I'm going to read because I want to spend the time having a conversation. And good morning, Andrew Kaplan in Antigua this morning.
Ooh, and of course, my lovely wife, Lynn, out
And
there
Lynn.
listening this morning.
All the good people who hold us down. Good morning, Glenn.
Hey, Glenn.
Good morning. Good
Welcome.
morning. Glad to be
Hey,
here.
Glenn.
It's nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you.
You know-
Likewise.
You know, I want to start off by saying Glenn and I know each other for a bunch of years now. And when he threw his first benefit at the Tribeca rooftop for Just Leaders USA, Just Leadership USA, he called me up a couple of months in advance and asked me if I would be one of the first leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't imagine what an honor that was, because it was really like, because, you know, people don't know when you come back from prison, man, it's traumatic, you know, and to actually be welcome into that kind of a society and community that you created was really lovely. So thank you on behalf of my wife and myself. Thank you.
I appreciate that. You know, for me, I had been about 13 years out of prison by that point. And what struck me was that while I was exposed to a tremendous amount of opportunity, most people coming out of prison are not, and that there's no community for people to return to for the most part. And so the idea that I could take whatever privilege I've amassed and whatever access to resources and really try to drive that towards other people who've been in the criminal justice system to help them get over some of the hurdles I was challenged with was important to me. And I appreciated support from people like you when it was only a vision. It's amazing what it is now, you know, 604 leaders from all across the country invested in, but it definitely started as a vision. And for people like you to believe in it while it was still sort of a thought, if you will, and not brick and mortar, that was important to me. So thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
So Glenn, was the idea born in while you were incarcerated, or did it come after the fact?
It came after the fact. It was the culmination of years of me just sort of being on a journey and figuring out how to navigate coming out of prison and dealing with some of the very pragmatic things in the beginning, like trying to find a job with a criminal record, trying to be stably housed, healthcare, those sort of things. But then eventually realizing that people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. The idea that if you're the one impacted by an issue, if you're the one who's been harmed by an issue, your family, your community, or if you're the one who's caused the harm, that you've probably done more thinking about the solution than anyone else. And so why are we ignoring that capital? I mean, you wouldn't redesign a hospital emergency room without speaking to patients, right? People literally use that emergency room. And yet here we are talking about criminal justice reform without the very people who actually have been through the system. And that to me was ridiculous. But the reason I learned that was actually pretty serendipitous. I ended up at a public interest law firm. They would bring me into the rooms with the head of parole, the governor, and all these folks. And when we'd walk out of those rooms, people would say like, wow, you did such an amazing job in there, your perspective, your analysis. And I thought it was a joke. I mean, I earned a quality 2-year liberal arts degree while I was in prison, but I was around all these Yale and Harvard graduates and so on. But then it happened so often that I realized there was added value, that my experiential knowledge was just as valuable as their more traditional credentials, if you will. And I said, well, if that can work for one person, imagine if we multiplied that by hundreds, if not thousands of people across the country.
Yeah, but Glenn, when you read your bio, it says founder, founder, founder. So, I mean, there's something in your DNA where you know how to create things, create a vision, and then actually put the walls around it and actually create it. So before Just Leadership USA, you had founded the David Rothenberg Center at
the Fortune Society. Yes, the David Rothenberg Center, named after the founder. Before that, helped found a couple of other projects. Just founded my own organization now that I work from. You know, the first thing I should say to anyone who hears that and sort of lionizes me or other people as a result of being founders is this: I'm scared to death when I'm doing that sort of stuff. You know, like, it's important for people to hear that. Leadership is a scary place. And you always have to leap and then build the wings on your way down. You know, people sort of want to have it all in place before they leap. And that's why most people who have tremendous ideas never really get them off the ground. I'm the sort of person, I'm like, okay, there's a couple of feathers on this wings. Like, let me just take this leap, and I'm going to be so scared to death on the way down that I'm going to figure this out. I mean, the other thing is, if you've done prison, you've kind of done it all. Yeah. You know, it's like
there's no other fear. Like, you know, all fear factors have been removed.
That should be the parting comment on the show.
Seriously, like, if you've done prison, you're almost to the finish line in terms of the kind of things that life can throw your way. You know, there's probably just a handful of things left that can really cripple me at this point.
Yeah. Well, what I find interesting is when you were talking about you were in these spaces and then you started to understand that you had some value. I would imagine that you probably were the closest that anybody in those spaces came to somebody who actually came out of prison and talked to about prison kinds of things. Because those kinds of discussions happen in absence of people who have been incarcerated.
You know, I got to tell you, one time I really got my butt kicked in my career, a time when I was really scared, but it was the right thing to do, was when I got invited to the White House a few years ago by the senior policy advisors to then President Obama. Yeah. And I get to the White House, and I'm with 50 of my colleagues, and I'm the only one who can't get in because of my criminal record, even though I was invited there to have this discussion. And, you know, putting aside all the things that meant, to have a black president in power saying he cares about ending mass incarceration and at the same time not being welcomed into his home, if you will, but also just realizing, wow, I'm in a room with 50 people and none of them have a criminal record. And why is that? I mean, I'm not saying that only people with criminal records have solutions, but I am saying that we need to do a better job of helping people to not just regain their humanity, but realize that they actually bring value as we think about how do we redesign a criminal justice system that works for everyone, both survivors, victims, and the rest of the world, if you will.
Well, Glenn, you're back 13 years. I'm back 11 and a half. Babs, how many years are you back?
10.
10. So we've all lived through some big changes in the criminal justice conversation in this country. And I know for me, when I first came back, you couldn't even talk about criminal justice in polite conversation with anybody. They'd turn their back on you. And now I think that, you know, it's a daily occurrence. So you can go to a criminal justice conference 3 times a day, every day in this country.
Yeah, well, first of all, I've been back 18 years now.
Oh.
The 13 years is when I started building Just Leadership. I'm at 18 now. I'm an OG. Don't take that away from me. Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I mean, let's just even talk about resources for a minute. When I started this work, you know, I'm in the nonprofit space. Fundraising is a core part of what you do to move the work forward. There was about $15 million in the field each year. Easily now there's about $300 million in the field every single year on this issue. You know, this issue has evolved for better or for worse. I mean, I could argue that there's some things about the movement that are pretty messy right now that we need to work on. Although I think it's inherent to movement building, to be quite honest, and maybe we can delve into that a bit. But you're right. Like, this has become a mainstream issue, and that can be the fuel in the engine that moves us forward, or that can be problematic. You know, if we don't take seriously what is happening and the lives that are impacted, you know, we could sort of have this moment, if you will, and not really have a movement. And I'd rather a long sort of slog movement that leads to real systemic reform than a very well-funded moment that leads to nothingness. And so we need to ensure that although the conversation has gone mainstream, that it has not become trivialized and that
and glamorized,
and those sort
or
of things.
sensationalized.
I mean, look, if anyone has learned a lesson about the heroism in this field and how we reward heroes, and then at the same time how we rip heroes down and what that means, it's me. You know, to just address the elephant in the room for a minute. Like, I have spent the last year, as you guys know, I haven't done any interviews for a year. This is my first interview in a year, and I wanted it to be with folks who are directly impacted. That was important to me.
And we're honored by that, by the way. You know, this moment is not lost on us or our listeners, or I can't even tell you how many emails and texts and tweets we've gotten way beyond the normal one of our shows. And because, you know, this is your first interview, but also, you know, you've had a rabid following of loyal people.
I have. I've had a lot of people that have shown up for me. I have, however, you know, the biggest thing was sort of keeping my ego out of the way. There's been opportunities before this. There's been job offers. There's been interview offers and so on. And it's really easy to let the ego drive your decision making. But I remember going to prison and spending 6 years and saying to myself, how are you going to lean into this? And what are you going to learn from your behavior and what got you here? And I decided the same thing a year ago. Like, what are you going to learn from either, you know, forget about parsing out what you did and what you didn't do with the accusations a year ago, the Me Too accusations. But let's put that aside for a minute and let's not try to parse that out. Let's not try to help the rest of the world understand sort of what really happened there. Let's instead say, what is it about you as a man in America that you could have done differently in your role, and that could have sort of kept you from being set up for the situation you ended up in? And I got to tell you, the last year of learning from me has been phenomenal, and the ability to see the movement from the sidelines, if you will. I mean, being in the middle of a movement and being a leader is one thing, and you get a lot of information and analysis that way. But being able to take a moment and sit back and watch from the sidelines and not, you know, sort of lead from the back of the room, if you will, it's just been phenomenal, the sort of learning I've experienced along the way. And I'm hoping that if I ever return to the work in any meaningful way, that what I'll be bringing is the experience that I've had and the pain that's come with it. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say publicly that, you know, when I think of what I'm really sorry for, it's the pain that my family and people like Veronica, my partner, and others have gone through as a result of all this.
You know, Glenn, I host an online white collar support group every Monday night, and we're kind of doing for the white collar community what you've done to the general criminal justice, or with the general criminal justice community. And so we've really followed your lead in a lot of ways. But I was speaking to someone out in the Midwest yesterday, a woman, and she was having a consultant come over her house or her apartment and to talk about her case, because she's in active prosecution right now. And that's a pretty standard conversation that I could have with anyone on any given day. And I said to her, he's coming over your apartment and he's going to be alone with you? And she said, yeah, is there a problem with that? And I said, well, I would never do that. And that's kind of an awakening that I've had in all of this, that not only do we have to be super careful, especially in this climate, but in a way it kind of makes sense. You know, I would love to, as a minister and as someone who went to seminary, you know, I'd love to be able to go around giving hugs to everybody all day long. But I think that moment is not here in this country.
I don't think that's the issue. I think that's far away from what is really happening, because I think that gives it a sense of, absolutely you can hug people and absolutely you can be in spaces with people unsupervised. that's not the issue. The issue is taking somebody's power against their will. You know, that's the real issue. And you know, I don't know your situation, Glenn. I just know what I've heard, and I can't even imagine these accusations have done to you and your family and all those kinds of things. And I appreciate you addressing them from a place of transparency.
Yeah. So I appreciate this conversation. So they were accusations, and I was struck by how I went from accusations to condemnation so quickly, particularly in our community.
Yeah.
I was struck by the lack of a clear road for restoration. And that's not an indictment of our community, but that is to say something about the work we need to continue to do. I think my experience, again, not parsing out what was true and what was not for a second, could have been an opportunity for the community to show the rest of the world how we handle harm. And how we give people a chance to be accountable, and how we create a road for people to be restored. I didn't experience much of that. And again, it's not a condemnation of the community, but it is an opportunity for myself to be thinking about that, and hopefully for others in the community to think about that. The other thing I would say is that, you know, I said I spent some time leaning into this. I remember being at home and just like riling about what was happening to my partner. And she said, you know, well, before you get angry about what happened, you know, I understand there was some injustice in the middle of all this, but let's just use this to think for a while about what you could have been doing differently as a man in a position of leadership. And I said, well, what do you mean? How do I figure that out? How do I figure out what I could have been doing differently? She said, well, do you do or say things to men that you wouldn't do or say to women, or the other way around? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, when you're in a meeting and there's 8 men in a room and 3 women, do you tell the women to set up the conference line as opposed to telling the men? Like those sort of nuances. And I was like, yeah, that's actually true. And so, you know, I'd be the first person to stand up and be like, what do you mean? Like, we train more women than we train men. You know, I make sure that women work for me, that they get paid, that they're in senior levels of management. Like, that is a very, very privileged thing to be able to yell out loud when you're in the middle of being accused of something. Like, the fact of the matter is that I needed to exercise humility to be able to learn in this moment about what I could have done differently. Forget about what I think I did well. Like, listen for a minute and figure out what you could have done differently. And so that's what I've leaned into. And it has been painful and long and difficult. And yet I feel not that much different than emerging from prison and having learned a lot in the belly of the beast.
That's interesting. That's pretty heavy to sort of say it feels like that.
Oh, it felt worse. Like, this condemnation was actually worse than going to prison.
Did it feel worse because you were out and you were a star, or you are a star? You were a rising star. You were all these accolades, and you were doing. And this work is amazing, phenomenal, groundbreaking work. So, do you feel that that it was much more painful because of that?
You know, I think it was much more painful because, you know, when I was committing crime and I ended up going to prison, I had a very small circle of people around me, but they weren't friends. Like, we were ripping and running together, making money together. There wasn't a whole lot of pain in the fact that things ended up falling apart. I was surrounded by a lot of people who I know and loved, and who I thought knew and loved me, who condemned me rather quickly. And, you know, arguably there is no roadmap for all of this, and people didn't really know how to move through this space, myself included. But that's the other thing also. When you go to prison, there's millions of other people having the very same experience at the very same time.
That's true.
I mean, this is quite different. It's like, who do you turn to here?
But Glenn, when you say condemn, do you think that it was really fear? Because, I mean, this is a fearful place. I mean, people don't know what to do, and they're afraid of who they're going to be judged by who they associate with, or like the size and scope of the moment. And
Oh, totally fair. I mean, there were people who I told all along that there was something coming. I mean, funders in particular. And yes, people were extremely fear driven. And, you know, I've also learned in the middle of all this that my legacy lives on in individuals, not in institutions. Institutions are inherently risk averse. And so, again, that's something else I think about. Is I think about when I get re-involved, if and when I get re-involved in the work, and you try to strengthen and build movements, that it's the investment in the people that's so much more important than even the investment in the institutions. I'm not saying institutions don't have value, but definitely going back to your question, it was more painful than prison because there was so many people around me who I thought would stand for me. Or if you don't want to stand for me, stand for due process, stand for justice, stand for restoration, stand for redemption, stand for transformation, stand for second, third, fourth chances. I didn't experience that. I experienced it from the people closest to me, my family, but not from some of the people that I moved through space with for so many years. And then eventually people started coming around. Eventually some of the fear started subsiding.
Sure.
And the things that kept me alive, and I mean that almost literally, I can't tell you like how emotionally debilitating this was for me. But the thing that kept me alive was eventually people started telling stories of the things that I've done to inspire them over the years. And that took me away from the space of feeling devalued. And then, to be pragmatic here also, they were people who didn't get jobs, who didn't get grants, who didn't get awards or whatever they wanted from me that they didn't get over the years, and saw an opportunity to like put me in a pine box and nail it shut. And so there was a bit of that also. There was a bit of sort of public ranting from people who weren't telling the full truth about why they were actually ranting against me in the middle of that moment.
Well, did this cause you to kind of look at the difference between Glenn Martin the man and Glenn Martin the icon? Because you can get lost in that in a hurry. I mean, Glenn, there's nobody who was more of a name in criminal justice in this country than you. I mean, maybe 5 people in the country. And then all of a sudden, I mean, you can kind of get lost behind that.
Let me tell you, I've actually never been lost behind that. I've actually always known about the frailty of Glenn Martin. I've actually always known that I stepped into a leadership role quite reluctantly, to be quite honest. But I'll say a couple of things. One, I did what it took to raise the money, to build an institution, to invest in other people. And although we're in the middle of a social justice field that says that patriarchy and all those sorts of things shouldn't be rewarded and that we should change those systems, the fact of the matter is that it's exactly what it took for me to raise that money and to be able to invest in other people. And yet the entire journey, I sort of knew that this would be the end. And we tend to look back on history at our leaders and lionize them and romanticize them. I mean, God forbid there was social media during the time of Martin Luther King, during the time of John F. Kennedy.
And how?
The fact of the matter is that if you really look at the truth of the history of those human beings who we hold up as heroes now and who we romanticize, they're not much different than me or
Well, there
you.
was Hoover, so he was his
there you
own
go.
social media.
Glenn, one of the things we were talking about on Sunday over chili was that Michelle Alexander, I think she was one of your original advisory board members. So Michelle Alexander, in her great book, The New Jim Crow, called prisoner reentry the new civil rights movement. And so I've always thought about you more as a civil rights leader than as a criminal justice reformer. And I look at the history of what's happened in this country to civil rights leaders, and it's not pretty. It's not pretty. And it's not surprising to me that that there's an undercurrent looking to rip down civil rights leaders in this country.
Look, I'm nobody's victim. I've never been. I have accountability for creating the atmosphere that allowed for what happened. Having said that, if you want to get a black man out of leadership, you yell rape. That's always worked in this country. And that's something for people to think about. And that is not a defensive statement. That's an accurate statement. Again, I don't want to get into the details of what I did and what I didn't do, but there's so much more nuance behind what happened a year ago. And having said that, I have tens of thousands of friends and colleagues around this country. I could have emerged from all of this a long time ago. I am actually in a space where I want to be right now. Even now, today, as we speak, there's tremendous amount of opportunity for me. I'm good where I'm at.
Yeah,
I'm really good in this because this is going to make me emerge as someone much more thoughtful and probably most importantly, someone who is going to use whatever access he has to resources and power and privilege after this to elevate the leadership of women and to be even more thoughtful about that. And I've always been that person, but I actually think that this experience has exposed me to a level of thoughtfulness that most men never get the opportunity to engage in during their lifetime.
Let's unpack a little bit of race, because that statement was pretty powerful. That if you wanna undo a black man, holler rape, right? That's a very loaded statement. And as a sister, you know, I can't sit here and just not unpack it a little bit, not a lot, because we got a half hour left. So talk a little bit about race, the inequity of that, and the destruction of leadership based on, I think it's race. So
yeah. So, you know, Jeff, you were really kind in the way you described me as a leader in this space. It's never gotten lost on me that as a black man, a black formerly incarcerated man, that from the moment I walk through the door, forget about when I open my mouth, from the moment I walk through the door, there's a judgment happening. It's never gotten lost on me that one of the reasons I've been elevated into leadership is that I am a very palatable, easy to look at, articulate black man.
And that's the truth.
Yeah. Well, there are many black men out here who share my principles, my values, my ideas, and never get the opportunity I do. And I've always been one to sit in front of privileged audiences and let them understand that I know why I've been elevated into leadership. Yes, I bring skills and experience and ideas to the table, but I also am a black man that people find easy to engage, easy to talk to, and so on, at least professionally, at least the way I put myself forward professionally. And it's been a tremendous amount of responsibility to wake up every morning and to play that role. You know, you think I want to be sitting in a freaking suit all day, smiling in people's face and being articulate to be able to get the money I need to be able to do the work that I do.
Code.
No, I mean, this year off actually has been, I think this is the first time I'm rocking a suit in like the last year. Like I just want to be Glenn, but at the same time, even in our social justice space, the very same racial dynamics that play out in other places, the things we say we fight against, those dynamics exist in our space. Hierarchy of power, whether it's gender related, whether it's race related. You know how many rooms I've sat in where, yes, I've spoken truth to power, but at the same time, I mean, you know how many conversations black people have in the hallway after they have conversations in a room with white folks? Like those things are real.
Very
and I try
real.
to bring those conversations into the room, but at the same time, that has been my entire career. And, you know, with all due respect to my white colleagues, to my white progressive colleagues, the fact of the matter is that we have a long way to go internally in the movement before we help the rest of the country understand how to shake ourselves loose from the terrors of racism.
Yeah.
So talk about the work you're doing now.
Sure.
Let's shift a little bit from that, and let's talk about, because you go from just us leadership,
yeah,
and then you go to this. And so what is this work you're doing now?
So I'm doing consulting work, which is like a curse word. I think the only thing worse than consultant is lobbyist.
Disbarred lawyer ain't so great either.
So, you know, I'm doing consulting work, but what's fascinating about it is that, you know, I've had about 25 clients this year. I have 8 on any given day. They're not all criminal justice. So first of all, I get to see the nonprofit community. Most of my clients are nonprofit, from many vantage points at this point, right? I get to see that some of the dynamics that we're dealing with in the criminal justice reform movement exists in the HIV/AIDS world, exists in the environmental movement. And so that's why, although I know we're sort of in a weird moment in the movement, like it sounds to me is very similar to, it sounds like it's part of the natural evolution of any movement. And so I think I feel heartened by that, knowing that we're going to get past this and the community is going to come back together and we're going to continue to be bold and audacious, even if we're having, going through some bumps now. But then I have a bunch of clients who are criminal justice focused, and I'm dealing with a lot of executive directors. And so, again, it's one thing to live in your own skin and experience the world that way. It's quite another thing to be coaching other executive directors and hear their perspective of the movement and hear the similarities and hear the racial dynamics and hear the power dynamics and so on. And so while I could not have bargained sort of being out of the core of the work, like the fire that burns in my belly is like the work itself.
Yeah.
At the same time, being able to do the work vicariously through other people and not just help them raise the money and create tighter organizations, stronger organizations to be able to do the work, but really hear them as human beings and hear the things they're struggling with. They say leadership is a lonely place. It is. I learned that. At the same time, now I'm in community with other leaders. And it is a fascinating place to be, to sort of hear the shared experiences, the shared drama, how people go home and cry after they spend the day doing amazing work, and how there's still parts of their personal lives that are so not fulfilled because they're giving so much of themselves to the work. That is I mean, I feel like a professional therapist sometimes in my role.
Absolutely.
You're working with my pal Richard Bronson, right, out in San Francisco.
He is. So I'm on his advisory board. He's not one of my clients, actually. I'm actually donating my time there. But I've been fascinated by his work because, you know, he's taken a for-profit approach to a social justice issue, and I wanted to learn about that. I wanted to sort of get a sense of what that is like to actually try to make a profit for shareholders and at the same time do good work, and how do you straddle that line and make it work. And I got to tell you, like, one of the most fascinating experiences I've had is being in a room where he was pitching to some venture capitalists, and he ended up being chosen 3 out of about 12 organizations that pitched that day. And I walked out of that room. At first, I was disturbed by the fact that it was 100 women venture capitalists, and there were no black women in the room. That was sort of painful to see. But then I was wondering why I actually had a good feeling coming out of it. And you know what? Everyone in that room was there for a very specific reason, for profit, and they were clear about it. And there was no sort of false love in the room. It was just like, here's what we're here for.
Well, that's what money will do. Money is a great truth teller.
It's pretty amazing how much truth was in that room. I actually think that although, you know, we could have an argument about capitalism and what it's done to destroy our country, at the same time, there was something to be said for that sort of realism being brought into our space.
You know, one of the things Richard told me was that, especially at a time of 4% or less unemployment, that he's having better results getting the big box stores and the large employers to hire formerly incarcerated people than he is actually able to get the formerly incarcerated people to the job interview, because they're so traumatized by prison and they haven't been retrained and they don't know what to do. And so he can't even get them to show up. Yeah,
you know, I've done a lot of work at the intersection of employment and people with criminal records. In fact, that was the beginning of my career at the Legal Action Center. And I've done work on the EEOC, the United States EEOC guidance, and local laws that create protections for job seekers with criminal records. And you're right, that is one half of the work. The other half is we need to be prepared. I mean, I built an organization that invested in the leadership of formerly incarcerated people because I think the world has a responsibility to recognize that human beings make bad decisions and that there's value in every single human being. And then we as individuals have a responsibility to rise to the opportunity. And so, yes, if you're a job seeker in the labor market, you can be frustrated because you have a criminal record, and that has created a second class of citizenship in this country, and it makes it that much more difficult to get a job. And criminal record discrimination is easily a surrogate for race-based discrimination, whether intentional or not in this country. All of that is true. And at the same time, you have to invest in yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I am constantly spending time investing in myself, and I think we don't do enough of that as formerly incarcerated folks. And I understand all the challenges, but all the challenges notwithstanding, people need to be able to show up at that job interview and be prepared to make the best case.
Well, I just had a conversation with Bill Villano, who is the executive director of Workforce Alliance here in New Haven and Greater New Haven. And so he was talking about how they have deliberately gone out and looked for folks who are just come out of prison, and they set up here in New Haven before people get out, a place where they can go before they even get out, to sort of start that process of linking to services and job readiness and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's the way to go at this point. Like, we can't wait for people to get out and then try to capture them.
I agree. So, you know, the other thing I'd say to sort of put a punctuation on what I said a minute ago is, we have to realize that people, the issue with people with problems is that they act like people with problems, right? That's how they show up. And so you can't say, I want formerly incarcerated people to go get a job, recognizing all of the issues that got them to prison in the first place, and then not try to do whatever you can as soon as you get your hands on them.
Because those issues don't go away.
Those issues do not go away. And And, I always say I can easily get a person a job. I mean, I worked at the Fortune Society for years. They placed thousands of people into employment opportunities. But there's a difference between getting a person a job and helping them to retain that job and putting them on a career track and making sure they get a living wage. And part of it is society's responsibility, but part of it is the responsibility of the individual to recognize that he or she may not have been exposed to what they needed to hold down a job. I mean, I came out of prison with a college degree. I visited 50 employers in 30 days, got turned down over and over for a job.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that strikes me in GEM trainers, for if you didn't know, GEM is Glenn's initials, so it's GEM.
I like that.
Just so you know, GEM, right?
See how God calls you.
He's a marketer. He knows what he's doing. But I know that you raised the number that I was told by Raquel Virgo, was that you raised $21 million at Just Leadership. Now, maybe the number's bigger than that, but there's a skill set in there that, applicable across to any nonprofit, really. How do you put yourself in front of funders? How do you get them to listen to read your work and listen to your pitch? I mean, what's that about?
So a couple of things. One, I raised $34 million. Give me mine. Give me mine. Sorry. Second of all, I used to stick up jewelry stores for a living. And I did that for 8 years. And I bring that up because there's a set of skills that people often say, like, what was the turning point for you in life? Or, what made your life turn? Like, the point I'm trying to make is some of the same skills that I've had my entire life that I unfortunately applied.
So the same skills you use to stick up a jewelry store are the same skills when you get in front of these people.
It takes a lot of guts to pull out a gun on someone, a lot, because once you pull out that gun, there's no going back. And the same thing, it takes a lot of guts to sit in front of a person who is in power, who has a tremendous amount of money, and try to convince them that they need to invest in something that's amazing, that's happening, that can support others and create opportunity for human beings and strengthen communities and so on. And so that's the key for me. I am not asking you to give me money as an individual. I'm actually asking you to invest in something that's pretty amazing that I've built along with other people. I've never built anything by myself.
Yeah.
I've had ideas. I've had a vision. I came across a scrap piece of paper the other day that was like the beginning of Just Leadership. I posted it on my Facebook page. That's about all I did. The rest of it was in community. And so what I'm trying to get funders to do is to understand that they're investing in something. What most nonprofits do poorly is mission creep. They're not hyper focused on what it is they're building. If you can't help people understand your vision, it's hard for them to invest in it, unfortunately. And so when you say, my company now is called GEM Trainers, yes, I think about brand a lot. And it's really important because funders are getting bombarded every day with requests for support, and the person who packages their vision the best and is able to present it in a very succinct way is probably the person that has the best chance of being funded. And in the end, people fund people and ideas. They really know the content of the work you're actually doing. Unfortunately, most of my funders never even showed up to sit in on one of our leadership trainings, and maybe that's because they're too busy to do so. But the fact of the matter is that means that when I'm sitting in front of them, what they're really looking towards is whether this person has a vision and an idea they want to invest in, and whether they can actually pull it off. And so that's some of the things I do when I'm coaching my clients, is to help them be able to deliver and come away with those resources to move their vision forward.
One of the most profound things that I went through, and I've been doing criminal justice or maybe civil rights leadership for about a decade now, of some sort or other. And I had the opportunity to be in your emerging leaders training in New Haven. It was a one-day training. And facilitated by David Mensa, who I've never seen a better
who I just bumped into last night, by the way.
I haven't seen David Mensa in a very long time.
Really?
I've been in all kinds of entrepreneurial and lawyer trainings and everything. I've never seen anyone better than him. And at the beginning of the training, this is what he does. He tells everyone's at tables. Maybe there's 100 people in the room. And he said, everyone here who's a criminal justice leader, stand up. And all 100 people stand up. Then he said, all right, all of you who are not being paid as criminal justice leaders, sit down. And 97 sat down. And he said, our job is to get you to be able to be trained for your passion, for you to do the work and to be paid a living for it.
Let me tell you something. I believe people should be able to do good and do well, right? This idea that you should be able to do good work in the world and do it as a pauper, I think is ridiculous. It doesn't match.
But that, you know what? But we hold that romantic fantasy about that.
You know, we romanticize way too much. When I left prison, a correction officer said to me, a correction officer who I had known for 6 years, right? You know, in prison, you don't really talk to correction officers, but you do, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's always 1 or 2 correction officers that respect you and you respect them. And so I knew this guy was going to college, even though he's a correction officer. He wanted to get out, rode a motorcycle, worked on a farm early in the morning. I knew enough about him. And on the way out, he said, you know, Glenn, I'm wishing you the best. And in the middle of the conversation, very matter-of-factly, he said, you know, you being here helped me get my boat. But when your son gets here, he's going to help my son get his boat.
Whoa.
Ooh.
And hold on, I was struck by that. It's actually guided much of my work because if we think this is all about right and wrong and punishment and crime and not about money, then we're not really paying attention, right? So he reminded me that much of this is the fact that we've created an economic engine for rural communities all across the country.
Oh, absolutely.
With our prison system. But when I got to my career after prison, I remember one of my supervisors holding a senior staff meeting at her home. And when we got to her home in Long Island, I looked up and she had a boat in the yard. And I was just like, so everybody's got a goddamn boat except me. Like, what the hell is going on? Like, everyone at every point in this criminal justice system is obviously compensated for the work they do. And I just don't know if that's a bad thing. But one thing I do know is that formerly incarcerated people bring treasures to this work. They bring jewels to this work. They bring experience to this work. And they work just as hard, if not harder, than other people in the field. And yet they are the least compensated. And so, yes, I made sure that I built a training that ensured that that's one of the first things that we talked about was people being compensated for their time.
Yeah,
I need that training.
Yeah, I love your notion, Babs, about the romanticism. You know, because after prison, I went to seminary. You know my story. And I went to seminary, and then I went training, and I did my apprenticeship, and I got ordained, and I'm an ordained minister, and I do things in that work, and so I got invited to speak at someone's church in an affluent community here in Connecticut. I won't say Greenwich, but it was, right. and the person who invited me said, we'd love for you to come, but you can't ask for money, and Lynn said to this woman, you pay your minister at your church, don't you? What makes you think that, that we're not professionals, that we're not entitled to be paid for our time? And so it's very curious the way that people look at these things and they like to hold other people. They like to hold people apart.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I ended up with 50 staff positions at Just Leadership in 4 short years. And I didn't care what level people were on. People deserved to be compensated a living wage. How do I get people to focus on work and focus on movement building if they have to worry about how they're going to pay the rent, how they're going to have health insurance, how they're going to take care of their children? I think we need to, as we strengthen our community and build our community, I think we really need to take stock of the pay disparities that exist, whether it's across gender or a class, or you name it. I think those things exist in our field in a way that we don't want to admit. And it is so hard to show the rest of the world how to do things different if you haven't sort of cleaned that stuff up in your own backyard.
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. So as we wind down our conversation.
Are we winding down
We're
already?
winding down a little bit. So I want to hear you talk a little bit about what your hopes and dreams are moving forward. Like, what does Glenn E. Martin want for Glenn E. Martin 10 years from now, 20 years from now, tomorrow?
You know, not many people can be at the age that I am and say, if tomorrow were my last day on this earth, I actually would be really comfortable with the human being I've shown up as, good and bad and everything in between. And I really do feel that way. I have had some very bold ideas and have moved them forward and have recognized that they've impacted the lives of many people. And that's a rare thing for humans to be able to have that opportunity, especially when I came out of prison and literally the job I thought I was going to have was selling sunglasses for this guy who actually gave me a job and then an hour later said, oh, I didn't realize you had a felony. So imagine just what my trajectory might have been. Having said that, you know, going forward, I really would like to spend more time finding ways to invest in others. So that is just going to be part of what I do for the rest of my life, is how can I keep showing up for others? One of the first things I say to people when I bump into them, when I meet them, is how can I support you? What is it that I can do for you? So just taking whatever resources, network, and privilege I have around me and just really giving that stuff away. Because the stuff that was demystified for me, the opportunities I've had, much of it was serendipitous, and I need to recognize that and have the humility to recognize most people won't have that opportunity unless I also pay it forward. The other thing I would say is if I do anything again in the criminal justice space, you know, I mean, my last project was to work to shut down Rikers Island in New York. And, you know, it's going to take longer than I would have liked, but it's moving towards being closed forever. And it's a place where I was stabbed a number of times, 4 times when I was 16 years old, and then spent a year there years later that was just as insidious as the first year, as the first time. And so in some ways, sort of outdoing that is difficult because that is something where the first time I said I wanted to work to close down Rikers, even my closest allies were like, you might not want to say that again. Like, you know, that's kind of insane. So if I do something in, it's going to be bold, and I have some ideas. You know, I don't want to get ahead of myself. But what I hope for most is for our community to come together and be stronger and recognize that we can actually disagree on policy prescriptions, on strategizing with the ways we strategize. We can be, you know, recognize that some organizations get more resources than others. But if we don't love each other, and if we don't lean into this work, and if we don't develop community, and if we don't recognize that social media is divisive and it's not a way to build community, then we're not going to have a movement. We're going to look back and tell our grandchildren that we wasted an opportunity. So that's what I hope most for the movement, whether I get re-involved or not.
So Glenn, for an example, is that there's a lot of disagreement about the First Step Act. And some organizations are for because they think it's a great start, and some think it's not, doesn't go far enough. What's your opinion?
You know, I'm a supporter of the First Step Act because I was brought into the conversation about the First Step Act, recognizing that there was some divisiveness that was happening between very large organizations that I thought shouldn't have even had the privilege to say some of the things they were saying. Like, people were being very territorial. They were exercising organizational egos in a way that didn't sit well for me. And so I took the time, read the bill, recognized that the bill was nowhere near where I thought it should be, but that if we involved the leadership of formerly incarcerated people, we might be able to get it there. Yeah. And so I became a supporter of the bill. I love everyone who supports or opposes this bill, and I always will. And I will not engage in any divisiveness around this bill. I happen to be a person who believes in it. I recognize there are other people who don't. I hope that when all the dust settles, whether the bill passes or not, that we all continue to find a way to love each other and support each other and build community. Because again, if we can't model this stuff for ourselves, there's no way in hell we're going to teach the rest of the world to be more compassionate.
And we know right behind it is the Clean Slate Bill and all other kinds of bills that, you know, hopefully we can move the needle in our lifetimes a lot more than we would have expected.
We're also in the twilight zone. Anybody watching what's going on in D.C.?
Oh, did you see Rod Serling's daughter post the picture of Rod Serling in front of Donald Trump in the office with no commentary? I thought that won the internet.
As someone who's made a couple of trips to D.C. recently, doing some work there and had some interactions with folks at the White House, we are in the twilight zone. Oh, and so as long as we're not causing harm, like, let's get what we can, but let's also recognize that we are operating in an environment that hopefully we will never have to operate in again. I'm like George Bush. I mean, talk about the good old days. I mean, seriously.
I know.
Who would have thunk you?
When we are pining for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this has been a rich conversation.
Yeah, Glenn,
thank you.
I'm so glad to have had
this
opportunity.
For your time and presence.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Jeff, it was always good to see you and talk to you.
Babs, just before we sign off, this is our first anniversary show.
Oh my gosh.
Congratulations.
You know, I forgot all about it. Happy anniversary to us.
Glenn's our anniversary gift.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful history-making thing.
I'm glad I could play that role.
So thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, for sponsoring our show now more than ever. Thank you, Andrew Kaplan, for holding us down.
All right, love you, Babs.
And Lynn, thank you so much. And we will be back in another week and a half.
The 21st.
The 21st.
Fernando Muniz, who's the CEO of Community Solutions, Inc., and community leader Rosa Correa, who we love and we've known for a long, long time. Love you, Babs.
Love you, too.
So okay.
You've
Happy
been
holidays.
listening to Criminal Justice Insider with Babs, RAWLS-IVY, and Jeff Grant.